That cold morning, no one expected an act of kindness to change everything. Vincent Carbone had spent 37 years building an empire on fear, silence, and control. He ruled the streets of the Northeast through whispered commands, calculated vengeance, and the unspoken understanding that mercy was weakness. His name alone could make grown men tremble. His reputation preceded him into every room, every diner, every dark corner of the city where business was conducted in shadows. But on a single frozen morning outside Sal's diner, Vincent slipped on black ice. He fell hard, his 72-year-old body crashing onto the concrete with the sound of breaking branches. His bodyguards froze, the city froze, and then a waitress with tired eyes, worn hands, and nothing to lose helped him up. She didn't know who he was, or maybe she did, and it didn't matter. What began as a simple gesture, a hand offered in the cold, would unravel the carefully constructed walls around Vincent's heart. It would force him to confront the cost of his empire, the weight of his guilt, and the possibility that redemption might not come through power, but through the courage to accept kindness from someone he'd trained himself to see as invisible. This is the story of how a mafia boss learned to feel again, and how a waitress discovered that ordinary people can dismantle empires built on fear with nothing but compassion and truth. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here we show that even behind power and fear, there are still human hearts. Chapter 1. The Fall. The ice caught him mid-stride, and for the first time in 72 years, Vincent Carbone understood what it meant to have no control. He'd walked these blocks for 40 years, from Sal's diner to the old warehouse district, through the rain-slicked alleys where deals were made and messages were delivered in the language of silence. He knew every crack in the pavement, every shadow, every corner where the city held its breath. He could navigate these streets in complete darkness because he'd long ago memorized not just the geography, but the rhythm of danger itself. He knew which storefronts were connected to which organizations, which street corners belonged to which crews, which bars were neutral ground and which were battlefields. But he didn't see the black ice. No one does. That's what makes it lethal. His left foot went out from under him, not gradually, not in a way that his aging reflexes could correct, but suddenly and completely. For a moment that stretched like taffy, Vincent felt gravity betray him. His body, still strong despite the decades, still maintained through daily discipline and the iron will that had kept him breathing when others had stopped, couldn't compensate for the laws of physics. His hands reached for something that wasn't there. His mind, usually 3 steps ahead of reality, found itself completely present in a single instant of falling. He hit the concrete hard. The impact knocked the air from his lungs and sent a shock wave of pain through his ribs, his shoulders, the back of his skull. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. For a moment, he was just an old man on a frozen street, vulnerable in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be in decades. Around him, the city seemed to hold its breath. 2 bodyguards, Marco and Tommy, men who'd been with him for 15 years, who understood the code of silence better than they understood their own mothers, rushed forward, then hesitated. In Vincent's world, hesitation meant death. Hesitation meant you weren't paying attention. Hesitation meant weakness. But this wasn't an attack. It wasn't a test of loyalty or a moment where split-second decisions determined life and death. It was just a fall. It was just an old man on ice. It was weakness, and they'd been trained their entire careers to pretend weakness didn't exist. Vincent lay on his back, staring up at the grey December sky. The clouds were thick, pressing down like a hand on his chest. Snow was beginning to fall. Not the pretty kind from greeting cards, but the thin, hard kind that stung when it landed on exposed skin. He could feel cold concrete through his wool coat, imported from Milan 3 years ago, custom-tailored by a man who was now dead. His ribs ached, his pride ached more. He heard the bell above the diner door chime, that small silver sound that meant someone was entering or leaving. He heard footsteps, quick and decisive. He heard breathing that wasn't his own. "Oh my God!" a voice said, female, young, breathless, not frightened exactly, but urgent with genuine concern. "Are you okay?" Vincent turned his head. A waitress stood in the diner doorway, still wearing her uniform, faded blue with a coffee stain near the pocket and a small nameplate that read Maria in scratched letters. She was probably in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of face that suggested she'd learned early that the world wasn't going to be easy. But her expression now wasn't hardened or cynical. It was open. It was worried. It was kind. She rushed down the 2 steps without hesitation, her shoes scraping against the ice, and she knelt beside him without any concern for the cold or the wet, or the fact that she was kneeling in front of a man she didn't know. "Don't move too fast," she said, and her hand found his arm. Her touch was steady. "You hit pretty hard. Can you feel your legs? Do you think anything's broken?" Vincent had spent 37 years commanding respect through silence. He could walk into a room and make people move without saying a word. People did what he asked, not because they wanted to, but because the alternative was unthinkable. And they all understood what the alternative was. He'd never been asked if he was okay. He'd never been looked at with genuine care. He'd never been touched without fear or calculation behind it. "I'm fine," he said, his voice rough from the impact, raw from shock. "You don't look fine," the waitress said, and there was no judgment in her voice, just observation. She was already helping him up, her small frame bearing more of his weight than should have been possible. "Come inside. I'll get you coffee and make sure nothing's broken. You need to sit down for a minute." Marco started to move, his hand going toward his jacket, his eyes narrowing, but Vincent raised his hand, just barely. The gesture was subtle, almost invisible, but it was absolute. Marco and Tommy stopped. Vincent allowed the waitress to help him to his feet. His ribs screamed. The cold air burned in his lungs. But he stood, and she was there, her arm around his waist, holding him steady. "Thank you," he heard himself say. The words felt strange in his mouth, like he was speaking a language he'd once known but hadn't used in so long that he'd forgotten the grammar. She smiled, a real smile, tired and kind, the kind that comes from someone who's learned that small kindnesses are sometimes all we have, and said, "That's what people do. We help each other up." Chapter 2. The diner, Sal's diner, had been part of Vincent's landscape for so long that he'd stopped really seeing it. It was just a place, a neutral zone where transactions happened, where certain conversations could occur without drawing attention, where the noise of the kitchen covered voices that needed to be private. The booths were worn from decades of use, the vinyl cracked in places, patched in others. The counter was chipped. The tile floor had faded from whatever color it had been originally into a kind of grayish beige that spoke of age and constant cleaning. The owner, Sal himself, a man in his 70s with a perpetually stained apron and eyes that had learned early never to ask questions, knew better than to ask about who sat in which corner or how long they stayed or what kind of business was being discussed in hushed voices. But entering it with Maria felt different. She led him to a corner booth, his corner booth. Though he'd never thought of it that way, had just assumed it was always available, and she helped him settle into the seat with the kind of care nurses use with patients. Her hands were steady. Her face was open in a way that Vincent hadn't seen in decades, maybe in centuries. People in his world learned quickly to hide their thoughts, to wear masks so carefully constructed that even their reflections became suspicious. But this woman's face was like a mirror reflecting a world where people actually cared about strangers, where a fall on ice was met with concern instead of calculation. "Coffee?" she asked. Or do you need something stronger? I have brandy. Sal keeps it under the counter for the old guys who come in with stories. Coffee, Vincent said, black. She nodded and disappeared into the kitchen, and Vincent was left alone with Marco and Tommy, who took up positions near the door without being told. They didn't speak. They never did, unless spoken to. It was one of the rules Vincent had established decades ago. Silence, unless given permission to break it. It had seemed like strength once. Now it seemed like a kind of death. Maria returned with coffee in a white ceramic mug that had a chip near the handle. She set it down carefully in front of him, and for a moment she stood there looking at him, really looking at him in a way that Vincent felt might see through all his carefully constructed armor. "You're going to be sore tomorrow," she said, "but I don't think anything's broken. You're lucky. Black ice doesn't usually let people off that easy." Then she did something that shocked him. She sat down across from him. Actually sat down, as if they were equals having a conversation, as if she had time for a stranger who'd just fallen on her diner's sidewalk. "My name is Maria," she said. "I haven't seen you in here before, have I? I think I'd remember someone who takes falls like that without getting angry. Most men, they hit the ground and the first thing they do is blame someone. They blame the diner, they blame the city, they blame God. But you just lay there like you were used to falling." Vincent looked at her. Really looked at her. She was probably in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and lines around her eyes that suggested she'd seen her share of hardship. The kind of hardship that either breaks people or makes them stronger. There was no way to tell which one had happened to Maria, but Vincent suspected it was both. Her hands were rough, the nails short and practical, the skin marked with small burns that suggested she spent a lot of time carrying hot plates and grabbing at boiling water. There was a small cross on a silver chain around her neck, worn thin from years of being touched. "Vincent," he said. "And no, I usually just pass through." "Well, Vincent, who just passes through, welcome to Sal's." She smiled again, and this time it reached her eyes. "Breakfast is on me. You need food after a fall like that. Your body's in shock even if your mind hasn't caught up yet. That's what my dad used to say. He was a philosopher in his way." She left before he could protest, disappearing back into the kitchen, and Vincent sat there in his booth, holding a chipped coffee mug, feeling something he hadn't felt in decades. The simple human experience of being cared for by a stranger. Marco leaned against the wall near the door, watching the street. Tommy sat in the front booth, pretending to read a newspaper, but Vincent knew he was watching everything. Everyone who entered, everyone who left, everyone who looked at their boss for more than 3 seconds. This was the price of power. You were never truly alone, and you were never truly safe. But in this moment, with a warm mug in his hands and the smell of breakfast cooking in the kitchen, Vincent allowed himself to forget both of those things. Chapter 3. The Waitress. Maria returned with a plate that made Vincent understand, for the first time in a very long time, that food was more than fuel. It was a statement. Eggs, perfectly cooked with the yolks still soft, arranged on the plate with obvious care. Bacon, crisp but not burnt, piled to the side. Toast, real butter melting into the crust. Home fries, golden and seasoned with something that made them smell like 1,000 childhood mornings he'd tried to forget. She set it down in front of him and watched to make sure he ate. "Eat," she said. "Don't be polite. Just eat." Vincent, who spent his days commanding men and shaping destinies, who'd spent 4 decades making decisions that determined whether other people lived or died, found himself taking instructions from a waitress like it was the most natural thing in the world. He ate. The food was simple, but it was warm, and it tasted like something real, something honest in a way that very little in his life was anymore. As he ate, Maria sat across from him and talked. She talked about Sal's diner, about how she'd been working there for 8 years, how Sal had taken her on when she was desperate and pregnant and had nowhere else to go. She talked about working double shifts, about knowing everyone who came in, about the regulars who were really just lonely people looking for a place where someone would remember their name and their usual order. She talked about her daughter, Sophie, who was 9 years old and wanted to be a teacher. She talked about her mother, who was in a nursing home upstate, who'd had a stroke 3 years ago and spent her days looking out windows and sometimes recognizing her daughter and sometimes not. She talked about winter making the city feel smaller and quieter, about how the holidays were always hard because there was never quite enough money, and about how she tried not to let Sophie notice. She asked him questions too, nothing invasive, just real human curiosity. Where was he from? What kind of work did he do? Did he have family? Was he married? The questions came naturally, the way they do when someone is genuinely interested in another person's story. "What do you do?" she asked, genuinely interested, as if his answer mattered. Vincent paused. For a moment he considered telling her the truth. He considered explaining what it meant to be Vincent Carbone, what it meant to have spent nearly 4 decades in a world where loyalty was proven through violence, where respect was earned through fear, where every decision you made affected whether men lived or died, whether families kept their homes or lost everything. But instead, he said, business, logistics, things that keep cities moving. It wasn't entirely a lie. The machinery he'd built did keep cities moving, in a sense. It was just machinery built on fear and debt, and the understanding that some people were expendable. "That sounds important," Maria said. She didn't probe further. She just seemed to accept that everyone carries parts of themselves they're not ready to share. Everyone has shadows. Everyone has reasons for keeping certain doors locked. "My dad did something like that," she continued, "worked all the time. I barely saw him. He'd come home late and I'd be in bed already. On weekends he'd sleep most of the day. I think he was tired, not just from work, but from—" She paused, searching for the word. "From carrying something heavy. That's what I think now anyway. I don't think I understood it then." There was no judgment in her voice, just observation, just the weight of her own loss speaking in simple words. Something shifted in Vincent's chest. Something fundamental, like tectonic plates moving, like the ground of his entire being rearranging itself. A feeling he'd learned to suppress decades ago, loneliness, naked and awful, suddenly surfaced. He'd been so busy controlling his world that he'd forgotten what it felt like to simply exist in another person's presence without pretense, without calculation, without the constant hum of danger underneath everything. "I'm sorry about your father," he said. Maria nodded. "Me too, but that's life, right? We get these moments with people and then they're gone. So we should be kind when we have the chance. That's what my mother always said, even before the stroke. She said the world has enough pain. We don't need to add to it." She stood up, squeezed his shoulder gently, and disappeared to attend to other customers. A construction worker who ordered the usual, an elderly woman who sat alone and seemed grateful just to be greeted by name, a young couple who barely looked at their food because they were looking at each other. Vincent sat alone with his coffee, and for the first time in years, maybe the first time since Catherine died, he felt the sting of tears. Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories of redemption and courage can travel. Chapter 4. The Investigation. That evening, Vincent sat in his office, a warehouse space converted into something almost luxurious, all dark wood and leather, all controlled lighting and soundproofed walls. It was a space designed for power. The furniture was expensive. The art on the walls was chosen by someone who understood that aesthetics were a form of communication. But as Vincent looked around, he realized that it was also a space designed for isolation. He did something he rarely did. He asked questions about Maria. "Background check," he told Marco, who'd driven him home in silence. "The waitress at Sal's diner. Maria. First name only right now, but you'll find her." Marco looked confused. In 30 years, Vincent had never asked about a waitress. He'd never asked about anyone unless they represented a threat or an opportunity. These were the categories through which he filtered the world. "Boss?" Marco said, and there was a note of concern in his voice. The kind of concern you feel when someone you respect starts acting in ways you don't understand. "She helped me up," Vincent said simply. "I want to know her story." "Should I be concerned?" Marco asked. "Is she connected to anyone?" "No," Vincent said. "Just find her." By the next morning, Marco had a file on Vincent's desk. 15 pages. Maria Delgado, 32 years old, worked at Sal's diner for 8 years. Single mother. Daughter, Sophie, age 9, currently in 3rd grade at St. Catherine's Elementary School. Father, Luis Delgado, deceased 10 years ago. Cause of death listed as heart attack, though the file contained some additional notes about previous criminal associations that were left deliberately vague. Mother, Carmen Delgado, currently in Shady Pines nursing home in Binghamton, stroke patient, non-verbal most days. No criminal record, no connections to organized crime, no political affiliations. No debts except the mortgage on an apartment in a neighborhood that was struggling but trying. Worked double shifts almost every day, averaging 56 hours per week at $7.50 per hour plus tips. Owned nothing of value. Had $5,000 in savings, probably accumulated over years of careful budgeting, probably all she had in the world. Vincent read through the file 3 times, and with each detail, something inside him deepened. This was a woman who'd been knocked down by life repeatedly and had chosen to help a stranger on the ice anyway. This was courage. This was the kind of strength that Vincent had spent his entire life trying to dominate through force, and now he realized he'd been fighting the wrong enemy all along. He looked at the photograph that Marco had included, Maria at the diner counter, smiling at someone off camera. In that photograph, she looked like she'd already won something worth winning. She looked like someone who'd made peace with things that Vincent was still at war with. There was also a note in the file. Father was connected to operations. Disappeared from payroll in 2014. Intelligence suggests internal removal, but no records. Likely connected to power struggle. Daughter was unaware of father's business. Mother also unaware. Standard protection measures put in place for the family after the elimination. Anonymous contributions have maintained their standard of living. Vincent understood immediately. Maria's father had worked for the organization. Her father had been eliminated by Vincent's order, though Vincent couldn't remember the specific situation now. And then, through a chain of command that he'd set in place decades ago, the man's family had been protected. It was the least they could do. It was also completely insufficient. He looked again at the photograph of Maria smiling. He thought about her father, a man whose name he couldn't remember, but whose daughter was kind. He thought about the weight of all the decisions he'd made, all the men he'd ordered killed, all the families left behind, all the daughters who'd lost fathers. And he understood that he was running out of time to do anything about it. Chapter 5. The Return. Vincent went back to Sal's diner the next morning at 6 a.m. When Maria's shift started, he sat in his corner booth and ordered coffee and eggs. He watched her move through the diner with grace, a grace that came not from training, but from practice, from doing the same small movements thousands of times until they became poetry. She attended to customers, remembered orders, laughed at jokes from the regulars, made sure no one's coffee got cold, made sure no one felt invisible. She was the kind of person who made other people feel seen, something Vincent had spent his life learning to do through fear. But she did it through genuine attention. She did it through actually caring whether they were okay. He came back the next morning, and the next, and the next. On the fourth morning, Maria came to his table and said, "You know, Vincent, you don't have to keep coming here just to be nice, but I'm glad you're here." "Why?" he asked. "Because," she said, sitting down across from him again, her shift still ahead of her, but she was taking this moment anyway. "You look like someone who's carrying something heavy. And when someone sits in that booth every morning, looking at their coffee like it has the answers to the universe, it means they're looking for something. My dad was like that at the end. He just sat. He thought he was trying to figure out how to let go." Vincent felt something break inside him. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, like ice thawing in spring, like something that had been frozen for decades, finally allowing itself to move again. "I've done things," he said quietly. The admission felt like stepping off a cliff. Bad things, the kind that don't have forgiveness. Maria looked at him for a long moment. She didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She just sat with his confession the way she sat with everything, with kindness. "I don't believe that," she said finally. "I think every person gets to choose again, even if they chose wrong before. That's what I have to believe. Otherwise, what's the point? We're just trapped in what we used to be." Chapter 6. The Wait. 2 weeks into his daily visits, Vincent told Maria about his daughter, not about his empire, not about the men who answered to him, or the decisions he'd made that had shaped the city's underworld for 4 decades, not about the violence or the fear or the machinery of control he'd built, but about Catherine, who was born on a Thursday in March and had his eyes and his mother's smile. Catherine, who wanted to be a social worker. Catherine, who believed in helping people, in redemption, in the possibility that people could change if they were given the chance. Catherine, who'd been 19 years old when a car accident on a rain-slicked road ended her existence. She was kind, Vincent said. His voice sounded like it was coming from someone else, someone younger, someone who hadn't spent 40 years in the dark. Like you. She wanted to be a social worker, help people. I tried to protect her from the world. And then the world took her anyway. Maria listened. She didn't offer platitudes. She didn't say everything happens for a reason, or she's in a better place now, or time heals all wounds, all the hollow comfort that people usually offered. She just listened, and her presence was enough. After she died, Vincent continued, and he was aware that he was crossing a line, that he was saying things he'd never said to anyone. I told myself that kindness was a weakness that had killed her, that if I'd been harder, more controlling, more cynical, I could have kept her safe. So I became the opposite of Catherine. I became everything she would have hated. I built this empire not because I wanted to, but because I thought it was the only way to survive in a world that had already taken everything that mattered. He paused, collecting himself. I've spent 37 years being hard, being ruthless, being the kind of person who makes other people afraid. And it didn't keep me safe. It just made me alone. Maria reached across the table and took his hand. She didn't say anything, she just held it firmly, held it steadily, held it like she was anchoring him to something real. And Vincent, for the first time since Catherine died 23 years ago, allowed himself to cry. Not in public, not completely. But tears came, and Maria didn't look away. She just held his hand and let him grieve. Not just for Catherine, but for all the years he'd spent avoiding feeling anything at all. If this story already has your heart, hit the like button. It helps the story of Vincent and Maria reach more people who still believe in compassion. Chapter 7. The Choice. Everything changed after that morning. Vincent began to liquidate his empire, not dramatically, not in a way that would alert his competitors or destabilize the machinery he'd built, but deliberately and methodically. He transferred operations to his younger associates, men like Dominic Russo and Tommy Castellano, Men who understood the business and wanted to stay in it. Men who had the hunger that Vincent was discovering he no longer possessed. He didn't explain himself to anyone. He didn't need to. His word was law, and his word now was withdrawal. But there were meetings, conversations conducted in the old warehouse space, where Vincent explained his reasoning in ways that made sense, even to men whose entire worldview was based on the concept that power was permanent and eternal. "I'm tired," he said to the Council of Captains who'd served under him for decades. "I've run this organization for 37 years. I've made decisions. Some of them were right. Some of them I'm going to spend whatever time I have left trying to make right. But I'm done. I'm stepping back. The business continues. The structure continues. But I'm done." Some of his men questioned him. Marco asked if he was dying, and it was a fair question, because the only reason Vincent could imagine for a man like him to step away was terminal illness. Tommy wanted to know if someone had threatened him, if there was a power play he needed to understand, but Vincent just said, "I'm taking my life back." Using his vast wealth differently now became Vincent's primary focus. He established a foundation in Catherine's name, Catherine Carbone Foundation for Social Work Education, scholarships for kids who wanted to study social work, grants for non-profits that worked with at-risk youth, funding for counseling programs in schools. He made donations that were significant enough to create real change, but anonymous enough that no one could trace them back to him. He paid off Maria's apartment through a series of shell companies and careful legal work that Marco coordinated. It took some careful maneuvering to do without her knowing, but Marco understood the assignment. He also ensured that Maria's mother's nursing home care was fully funded, that Sophie's education was set up in a trust fund that would cover everything from private school to college. He started to do something he'd never done before. He listened, really listened. He sat in Sal's diner and listened to the stories of people around him. The cook, Diego, who'd escaped from a cartel in Mexico and carried the trauma of that escape in his bones. The regular customer, Mrs. Chen, who'd survived cancer and came every morning to give thanks for another day alive. The old man, Frank, who'd lost his wife 32 years ago and came every morning because the diner made him feel less alone, because Maria remembered his name, because small kindnesses were sometimes all we had. Vincent realized that his entire life he'd been so focused on being feared that he'd never learned to be heard. Not really, not the way Maria heard people. Not the way you heard people when you actually cared about their stories instead of what they could do for you. "You're different," Maria said to him one morning, about a month into his transformation. They were sitting in their booth, and she was on her break, and 10 minutes of peace in a shift that would stretch 12 hours. Something shifted. "What happened?" "You happened," Vincent said. "You helped me up. You showed me that the world doesn't have to be conquered. It just has to be met with kindness." Chapter 8. The Revelation. On a cold afternoon in January, as snow fell against the diner windows, Maria sat across from Vincent and told him the truth. "My father," she said, and Vincent could see that this was difficult for her, that she was choosing to trust him with something she'd carried alone for a long time. Wasn't just anyone. He worked for someone important, someone dangerous. Vincent's body went rigid. He'd known this. He'd read the file, but hearing it from her was different. "After he died," Maria continued, "that person, your predecessor, I think, though I'm not sure of the details, made sure my family was taken care of, anonymously. Money arrived for my mother's care. My education got paid for. We had help when we needed it, always at exactly the right moment. I never understood why, but I knew it was connected to my father's death." "Maria," Vincent started, but she held up her hand. "Let me finish. I never wanted to know the details because I wanted to believe that the world was better than my father's circumstances suggested. I wanted to be kind instead of whatever my father was. I wanted to help people, not hurt them. I wanted my daughter to grow up in a world where good things happened because people were good, not because people were afraid. She took a breath. And then you came into my diner, and you fell, and I saw someone who looked exactly like my father looked at the end, like someone carrying so much grief that it was crushing them from the inside. When I helped you up, I wasn't helping you because I knew who you were. I was helping you because helping is all I know how to do. But now I understand why you kept coming back. Now I understand that you've been trying to be the opposite of who you were, just like I've been trying to be the opposite of my father. I knew your father, Vincent said quietly. The words felt important. The words felt true. His name was Luis. He worked for me, and I... He paused. The next part was the hardest. And I ordered his death. The words hung in the air between them. The diner noise seemed to fall away. The other customers, the cook in the kitchen, the sound of traffic outside, all of it disappeared. There was just Vincent and Maria, and the weight of truth, finally spoken. Maria didn't look away. I know, she said. I found the files. Marco left them where I could find them. I think he wanted me to understand. Why haven't you reported me? Vincent asked. You should turn me in. There's a statute of limitations, but there are still things, crimes I've committed, things I should answer for. Because, Maria said, taking his hand across the table, her grip firm and steady, you already turned yourself in, to your own conscience, to Catherine's memory, to the possibility of being better. That's a kind of justice that actually means something. Chapter 9. The Epilogue. Vincent Carbone died on a Tuesday in March, almost exactly 4 months after he slipped on ice outside Sal's diner. His death was quiet, a heart attack in his sleep, in the small apartment he'd rented after leaving the warehouse office. He'd given almost everything away, the money distributed through the foundation, the properties liquidated, and the proceeds donated to various causes, the furniture sold, the art placed in museums. The few things he left behind, Catherine's photographs, her social work textbooks, letters to be opened, went to Maria. The funeral was small. Marco came. Tommy came. A handful of men from the old organization came to pay respects to someone who'd shaped their lives, for better and worse. Sal came from the diner. A few of Maria's friends came, but mostly it was quiet. The day after his funeral, Maria took Sophie to Catherine's grave. It was a cold morning, the kind of morning where winter hadn't quite released its grip. They stood together at the headstone, Catherine Ann Carbone, 1975 to 1994, beloved daughter. And Maria told her daughter about Vincent. Not about his crimes, not about the violence or the fear or the years he'd spent in darkness, but about his transformation, about how a person can carry darkness their whole life and then choose to carry light instead, about how redemption isn't about erasing what you've done, it's about choosing differently every day for the rest of your life. He helped us, Maria told Sophie, without ever telling us he was helping. He saw us when we were invisible. He made sure we had what we needed, and he did it because he'd learned to see people the way they deserve to be seen. Sophie left a flower at the grave, a small forget-me-not that she'd brought from home. That evening, Maria went back to Sal's diner for her shift. She served coffee to the regulars, remembered their orders, listened to their stories. She was doing the work that Vincent had finally learned to see as sacred. The work of making people feel less alone. The work of helping each other up when we fell. And in the corner booth, the one that had been Vincent's, Sal placed a photograph on the wall. It was one that Marco had taken without Vincent knowing. Vincent and Maria, sitting across from each other holding hands, both smiling like they'd finally found what they'd been looking for. Below the photograph, Sal wrote a simple inscription in careful letters. Real strength is kindness. Real power is compassion. Real victory is choosing humanity over empire. This was Vincent's final lesson, and his greatest gift. Outside, the rain fell on the city streets. The neon signs hummed in the darkness. The city moved on, carrying its stories, its grief, its small moments of grace. The machinery of power continued, different hands now holding the levers, but the city moved on. And in Sal's diner, a waitress poured coffee for people who needed to feel seen, just as she always had. Because that, she understood now, was the only kind of immortality that mattered. The echo of kindness that outlives the person who gave it. The ripples that spread outward from a single hand offered in the cold. The redemption that comes not from being forgiven by the world, but from becoming someone worth forgiving. On quiet mornings, when the diner was almost empty, Maria would look at the photograph on the wall and remember Vincent's hand in hers. She would remember the weight of his grief and the courage it took to set it down. And she would pour coffee and hold space for other people carrying heavy things, because that was what Vincent had taught her, that the world didn't need more power. It needed more kindness. It needed more hands offered when people fell on ice. It needed more people brave enough to help each other up. Subscribe for more stories of loyalty, forgiveness, and redemption. Thank you for watching the case of Mafia boss slipped on ice outside diner. Waitress helped him up, not knowing he'd change her. See you in the next one.